Good morning, guys. Today we are going to be discussing prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So yesterday Mr. Queller went over what makes something living, and today we're going to talk about the different types of cells that organisms can be made of. And the two main types that we have are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Okay? We're going to focus on each of them at a time, but before we do, let's kind of look at just the difference in what they look like, right? You can see that this is a pretty simple shape. It doesn't have a lot of parts and pieces in it, right? This is a very simple organism. And a lot of times we see prokaryotic cells as single-celled organisms like bacteria. If we look down here at the example of our eukaryotic cell, it's got a lot more stuff going on, right? It's got all kinds of different shapes and squiggly lines and dots and all kinds of things that make it look a lot different than our prokaryotic cell. So this is our diagram of a prokaryotic cell, and this is our diagram of our eukaryotic cell. So what makes them so different? There's a lot of things that make prokaryotic cells really, really different from eukaryotic cells. So I'm going to color code these purple and yellow. Purple for prokaryotic, P for purple, and yellow for eukaryotic cells. The first and major difference is that this pro, kind of a shortcut way to remember, is that kind of reminds us that there is pro, no, they rhyme, right? They both got that O. That means no nucleus. No nucleus. Okay? And the nucleus is kind of the control center of a eukaryotic cell. Prokaryotic literally translates to before. The word part pro means before. And then karyotic means nucleus. Okay, so when they were originally coining these terms, right, prokaryotic, pro is before, and karyotic is nucleus, right? These types of cells do not have a nucleus. They have circular DNA, which just means, do you see how it's just all a whole bunch of squiggles? It's not a particular shape, right? And it floats freely in the cell. This is really different from a eukaryotic cell, and we're going to talk about it in just a second. It does not have any of those shapes inside, right? Those membrane-bound organelles. What is an organelle? Well, we know that an organ is like a part of our body, right, that helps it work, like our heart or our lungs or your brain, right? And so organelles literally means little organ. Okay? These are little organs that are inside cells that help it work. Now, this term right here, membrane bound. A membrane is really just like a layer, right? So if I have this zippy bag full of cap racers, they are bound in this bag, right? They can't get out. They're not just, going to pour out every time I move it, right? They're bound in this membrane. And so we don't have any organelles in a prokaryotic cell that are bound by a membrane. The only membrane that's containing anything, the only layer that's containing anything, is the outside, right? The outside layer is containing the DNA and the cytoplasm that's inside, okay? These types of cells are typically way smaller than eukaryotic cells. They are usually unicellular, right? Meaning one cell, right? It's a single-celled organism. But they can be aerobic, or anaerobic. meaning some of them, the anaerobic ones, can live without oxygen. Aerobic is a word that means needing oxygen, right? Having to do with oxygen. Okay? So anaerobic means no oxygen, right? It doesn't require oxygen to survive. So prokaryotic cells can be either one, right? They can need oxygen or they cannot. Eukaryotic cells are really different than that. They're going to need some help. So you also have our diagram over here, and we're going to go over some of these parts. Now, we already talked about this as the what? The DNA. And DNA is in every cell because DNA is the recipe for what that cell does. It's the instruction book, right? It tells the cell what to do. And if our DNA mutates or gets damaged in some way, then it doesn't tell the cell to do the right thing, right? That's when we can get things like cancer cells, right? And when their DNA mutates and it's reading the wrong set of directions, okay? Now we also have all of this area in the inside. So if I take my colored pencil, all of this is actually filled with kind of this gel that's called cytoplasm. I feel like that word kind of sounds like it's a gel, right? Cyto means cell, and plasm, I guess, means goo. So this is the goo that fills the cell, okay? Now, ribosomes are these little dots. I'm not sure if you can see, but there are all these little dots inside this cell. And ribosomes are really important because they are protein factories. And most cells' jobs are to create proteins of some type, right? So this is important for the cell to be able to function and do its job. This is the, let's say this long little like tail back here. What is it? What do you think that's for? This is the flagella, and the flagella actually helps it to move, right? It helps this cell to propel itself because that's one of those characteristics we talked about for living things, right? It's able to move. So the flagella is what allows this cell to move itself around, okay? All right, so we talked a little bit about prokaryotic. Now let's go skip our little table for now, and we're going to come down here to eukaryotic. So eukaryotic U means true, and karyotic we already said means nucleus. Okay, so this is the true nucleus because it does have a nucleus. Now remember, I'm color coding mine and using yellow for eukaryotic. If you want a little tip, U sounds like do. They do have a nucleus. Okay, just a little trick to help you remember it. Now remember, we talked about our membrane, right? Now this was a good example of just our DNA floating around, right? But a eukaryotic cell is more like lots of things bound in membranes, right? We've got a membrane or a layer around our peppermints. We've got a layer around all of our little cap erasers that's containing them. And then there's this outer layer, right, which is containing all of it. So all of these things inside this bag are bound with a membrane. They're bound with a layer. And the same thing is true for eukaryotic cells. Okay? Eukaryotic cells have membrane-bound organelles. They have all of these pieces and parts that help that cell to function. So which do you think is more complex? A eukaryotic cell or a prokaryotic cell? I hope you said a eukaryotic cell, because it has all of these different pieces and parts, whereas this is a more simplified version, right? This was before a nucleus developed in cells. Okay? These types of cells, eukaryotic cells, are typically much larger than prokaryotic cells. They're way bigger. In fact, there's a couple of eukaryotic cells that you can see with your eyes. Usually, eukaryotic cells are part of a multicellular organism, meaning multiple cells, right? Like us, we're made of eukaryotic cells. And almost all eukaryotic cells need oxygen to survive. So do we remember our word? Aerobic. Aerobic, meaning most need oxygen to survive, right? Aerobic is that word that has to do with needing oxygen, okay? So if we come over here to our diagram, let's label some of the parts of our eukaryotic cell. Now, the main defining feature is that it has a nucleus. So our nucleus here, you see how it's bound with this layer? That's that membrane that goes around it. So this is our nucleus. Eukaryotic cells also all have a layer that goes all the way around like this, right? I'm sure you guys can see that. And this layer is the cell membrane. Okay? Now, we've got our nucleus, we've got our cell membrane, and then we've got all these, what do we call them? Membrane bound organelles. Remember, organelles just means little organs. These are the little organs of the cell. Okay? All right, so now that we've gone over eukaryotic and we've gone over prokaryotic, let's kind of make us a chart to help keep track of everything. So I'm going to take and use the left side as my prokaryotic, my purple, and my right side is going to be yellow for my eukaryotic characteristics. Okay? So we're going to use the information I just went over to fill in our table. Okay? So our prokaryotic cells, are they going to be multicellular or unicellular? They're going to be unicellular, right? They're single-celled organisms. Right? We can look back in the stuff that I just went over with you to help you, right? What about prokaryotic? Man, I'm flipping myself around. So prokaryotic, unicellular, and eukaryotic are going to be multicellular. They're made of, usually organisms that have eukaryotic cells are made of multiple cells, like plants, trees, people, dogs, cats, snakes, right? So, since we're talking about examples, let's give a few examples of prokaryotic cells. Some prokaryotic cells, most of them are bacteria, like E. coli, staph, strep. Those are all bacteria that are prokaryotic cells. Blue algae is another example. Okay. Now, when we talk about eukaryotic cells are what you are made of. So humans, maybe your dog, tree, right? All kinds of things. Plants and animals are all eukaryotic organisms. Nucleus. Which one had a nucleus? Which one? Well, if we look down here, eukaryotic means true nucleus. So the nucleus is going to be here, right? Has a nucleus. It's bound in a membrane. Okay. Prokaryotic cells, no nucleus, right? They do not have one, right? They've got a wad of DNA that just floats around. They don't have a control center that manages what the cell does, okay? DNA structure, it's just kind of circular, messy. It doesn't have a particular shape, but the DNA structure in eukaryotic cells does. If you've ever seen that diagram of that double helix, right? That's what the DNA shape is like in a eukaryotic cell. So we're going to write double helix is the DNA structure. The DNA location, where do we find our DNA in a eukaryotic cell? It is found inside the nucleus. Right? That's what makes the nucleus so special, is that it holds the DNA and it gives instructions to the other organelles in the cell. Now the DNA location in our prokaryotic cells, remember, is just kind of floating around. So it's just floating freely. Okay? In the cytoplasm. Now, remember, we were talking about yesterday the criteria for something to be living or non-living. Now, prokaryotic cells are exclusively asexual. They reproduce asexually. That means they don't need a partner, right? That means they just make exact duplicates of themselves, right? Which is good for them to be able to survive, but it doesn't give them a lot of diversity. Well, eukaryotic cells are different. Obviously, you know that 2 parents are required to make a human baby. So when we have 2 parents, we call that sexual reproduction. But eukaryotic cells, some of them are asexual, so they're both. This creates a lot of diversity in the types of cells that we can have, right? So eukaryotic cells have a lot more diversity, right? We can think of all kinds of organisms that we're familiar with that are examples of eukaryotic organisms. It's a lot harder to think of things that we recognize as prokaryotic cells, okay? I hope that helps you guys fill in your notes, and I hope that you have a fantastic weekend. If you have any questions, please feel free to email Mr. Queller or I so that we can help you out.